I want to start with reading the poem that's on page 185 of A New Christianity, because I think it sets a very good tone for things. Not as in the old days, I pray, God, my life is not what it was. Once I would have asked for healing, I go now to be doctored. I would have knelt long, wrestling with you, wearing you down. Hear my prayer, Lord, hear my prayer, as though you were deaf. Myriads of mortals kept up their shrill cry, explaining your stillness by their unfitness. It begins to appear that this is not what prayer is about. It is the annihilation of differences, the consciousness of myself in you, of you in me, the emergence from the adolescence of nature into the adult geometry of the mind. Circular as our way is, it leads not back to that snake-haunted garden, but onward to the tall city of glass that is the laboratory of the spirit. I just think that's a great picture of I think where we're at. How many are like me that you've had your struggles with prayer as it was defined by those who went before you? Anybody else have that challenge?
Yeah.
What do we do now is the essential question that Dr. Spong asked. And it's been a central question of his entire career. His first book was on prayer, and it's a great book called Honest Prayer. There's a copy of it floating around somewhere. Someone has it. And it asks us, what is honesty in prayer? And is what we've been doing forever, what we were taught to do, is that truly prayer in its best sense? Tell me what your struggles have been.
I think that my struggle is that when something happens to one of my loved ones, I still fall back into that type of prayer that's asking for a favor rather, and I think that we do because we have done it for so long. And we fall back into learned behaviors in those stressful situations. And so, I recognized when he was talking about when his first wife had cancer, and I remember when my husband was in the hospital several years ago, I really fell into that. And yet in my head, I believe what he is saying about prayer, but in your heart, it's hard to get away from that.
The good news is it's not hard for any of the rest of us, just you. But you're exactly right. The behaviors that we were taught, the practices that we have used before, whether we liked them or not, definitely affect how we deal with today and what we fall back to. There is something comforting in some of those definitions of prayer.
Yes.
And or at least in the repetitiveness of what we have done before that way. How about the rest of you?
I've never really been one. I wasn't brought up in the church, so I never really struggled with prayer all that much. I never thought a whole lot about it. And it wasn't until I started going to the evangelical church that prayer entered my life in any way. And I just remember they did a thing, like I have health problems. And there was a time where it was like, you get anointed with this oil, special oil. I don't know what it was, melted Crisco or whatever, but it was some kind of special oil. And then they would lay hands on you and pray over you. And if you weren't healed, it was because you weren't a good enough believer, or you weren't, there was it was all your fault that you weren't healed. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't the fault of the prayer. And So I just, anyone that ever tells me that about my health, I'm just like, goodbye. I don't buy that, because I've lived with my health issues since I was young, very young. So prayer never really has meant anything to me. You know, I'm more, I guess, the thing that spoke to me more was when I started studying Buddhism, and meditation spoke more to me. And then I read a thing where it said, prayer is when you talk to God, and meditation is when you listen to God.
Oh, wow, that's very
I've
nice.
I've always liked that thought a lot, because when I meditate, I get very quiet and I listen to the universe speaks to me, which to me is pretty much God. So it's just a difference, I guess, in wording. I don't know.
I think you have an advantage, Judy. You don't have to unlearn all of the things that many of us have had since we were children.
Yeah, absolutely. And that unlearning is a challenge.
Very much so.
But I think you're right, Judy, that how we view prayer is very different. And the way we necessarily teach prayer is through words. But Dr. Spong made the point, and it's a point that I learned very strongly, that words will always fail us, right? That language that we use can't capture the essence of what we're doing in prayer. So in my own personal thing, I learned that I use less and less words with prayer. And I rarely stop and say a prayer any longer. Prayer is much different for me than that.
Which to me is meditation more, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But the question remains, kind of, how do we get to it? What is it that we do in order to achieve that space of that we sense is prayer? Especially because whatever we do, someone is going to say, no, that's not. You ought to, unless you say these words, and sometimes that person who says that is me, right? Because like many of you, I learned a formula for prayer. You say this, then you say this, then you say this, then you say this. And when I don't say that, especially when I'm around my family of origin who continues to use that formula, then I feel unprayerful.
Unprayerful.
Right? Even though I think I'm at a better place prayer-wise, it doesn't always feel like it because of that.
For me
Yep.
to have
You
any
hang
kind of
out with-
oh, go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry. I've already spoken.
I was just teasing Jim that he has to pick better people to hang out with.
Well, you know, one of those prayers that has a formula is saying grace before a meal.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow, you know, many cultures have feelings about being thankful for the food that they have before them, because in the past, way in the past, and even today, you know, food was not plentiful. And so that was something to be thankful for. But somehow there should be a way to say grace without all of these formulas that we have, to me.
Tell you a funny story about prayer and grace at dinner. And I was a poverty worker when I was 18 or 19, back in the hollers of West Virginia for a while. The great people of West Virginia.
Mhm.
decided to send some of their own college kids out in the hollers and stuff to do some poverty work. And so my first night there with this, you live with a family in the hall. I lived with this family up on the end of a holler. And it was the grandmother, the father, the mother, 3 kids, and then I joined the family. Had an outhouse, and it was very interesting. And the first night there, the grandmother, who is the matriarch of the entire family, looked at me and goes, well, the guest always says grace. Well, this girl had never said grace in her whole friggin' life. So I'll sit there and I'm like, my mind goes totally blank. I couldn't even go, thanks for this grub. Nothing at all came to this brain. Nothing. I just sat there. And it was like it became very uncomfortable until finally somebody else said grace. Well, the grandmother didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. I mean, it was like I absolutely did not have a clue about how to say grace, before dinner. And I will just never forget sitting there with that awful silence surrounding me while they were waiting for me to say grace. And this kid just had nothing to offer.
Part of that, I think, is because of identity, Judy. I think that prayer is really becomes an identity for us, and the way that we pray is very different than someone else. And so that prayer language, like when my mom, if I go out to lunch with my mom, she will always stop and say a prayer. Not always out loud. She will do it to herself, but I still know the words she's saying. She will always start with Heavenly Father, and she will always end in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. She will always say those words, right? And I can guess most of the words in between too. That's part of her identity. And so not doing that seems, I don't know if she would know how to live without doing that. And same with the old lady you were talking about. That matriarch was identified through those prayer practices, and for you to not be part of that identity assaulted her.
Yeah, I didn't fit into her paradigm of what a good person.
Yeah.
And then they also went to the river and baptized people. I mean, this was a very fundamental part of their life.
Yeah. And so when Dr. Spong essentially is questioning all of this, wow, right? He's questioning some of the very core things that sometimes we don't even talk about. I used to know the head speech pathologist at Boswell Hospital, and she worked a lot with stroke victims, right? And if you've had anything to do with stroke, one of the weirdest things about it is that you've forgotten things that you never remember learning. And speech is one of those. We've always talked. We always knew how to say the words that we say. And when suddenly that's taken away from us, it just throws us into a space that we just don't understand. And I think in some ways, that's what Bishop Spong is doing with prayer, right? And even though he tries to say, I go to the liturgical churches, I listen to them, I don't denounce them for being less than what I wish, he is forever calling people beyond that which is less than prayerful for him. So it's unsettling. Go ahead, Pam.
I think too that it's not just a matter of learning what prayer should be expressing, as he's talking about, but it's also that unlearning these formula prayers that you have grown up with, somehow denigrates the life that you have lived before this, unless you can find a pathway to say, I'm moving forward rather than I'm replacing.
Mhm.
And I think that is I would think would be a struggle that he would have with anybody he was trying to convince, who has grown up in a church that is very liturgically oriented.
Yeah. But see, that's why I love the story that he told about the other bishop, Richard Holloway, where that bishop was asked by the woman, Bishop,
Oh,
do you
yes.
pray? And he said, no, which I think is a great answer. Sometimes we try to explain first. I think we just need to very clearly say, nope, I don't. And he said, if I had said yes, you would have thought I prayed your way, because you don't see any other definition than that way. By saying no, suddenly we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's that conversation right now that we're lacking, because we all think we already know.
Yeah.
What is prayer? What is prayer? It's a fundamental space and a question for us to ask, and yet we don't. We sometimes do a platitude like prayer is talking to God. Well, we all know that it's not talking in the same way that we think of talking, right? The way we talk to each other. But what is prayer? What helps you to define prayer in your own life these days? What things make it feel like prayer to you?
What really spoke to me is, to me, his best thing on prayer of any of the books we read was the one on When Christianity Must Change or Die.
Changed my life.
And on page 144, he's like, I just really like when he goes, prayer is the active recognition that there is a sacred core in every person that must not be violated. And prayer is the ability to embrace the fragility of life and to transform it, even as we are victimized or killed by it. And it's like we are to live as if everything we say and do is a prayer calling others to life, to love, and to being. And that's the first time I've thought anyone's ever described a way of praying that spoke to me, that actually resonated with me and spoke to me. It's like, prayer is being present, sharing love, opening love to transcendence. How can you not say hallelujah to that?
Well, because the next line that you didn't read is, he said, it is not necessarily words addressed to heaven. And
Yeah.
That's exactly how we've always defined prayer, is that way, as words directed to heaven. And for us to move away from there, for us to challenge that, it's like the people who think that he does not pray because he doesn't do it that way. It's outside of that very huge paradigm. But you're right, Judy, these words that you just read changed my absolute life. They helped me to be able to finally have some way to be able to say, I pray. Because before them, I feel like what I did was say words of prayer, but not pray. These words allowed me to begin praying again.
I think that his idea too of that prayer is for him acts of living rather than, well, what we know definitely it's not petition to God to do something. But I mean, even if you don't petition God to do something, some people would still say that they speak to God. You know, that they may not be following all of the rituals or anything, but they feel like they're speaking to God, which I think is starting to get closer to that realm of meditation. you know, you aren't necessary, you're not petitioning, you're just trying to feel the universe in some way.
Yeah.
And I mean, he hasn't relinquished God, he's just relinquished the theistic view of God.
He hasn't, right?
And I think that's the thing that maybe, and I don't really know, I've never read anybody who's criticized him, but I can see that there'd be a lot of people who would criticize him.
Yeah.
That their view of this all-powerful God who is controlling everything is threatened by the idea that God is maybe in everything and around us in everything, but it's not controlling everything.
Mhm.
And so when you talk, you can talk to a God who is not controlling everything. Maybe as you would talk to a friend, but it would not be, oh, please, God, help me get through today. Although I have to say those words come out of my mouth, even really, I mean, you think about it, if you're having a really bad day, you automatically use those words because
Right.
you've learned those words.
Right. And you've learned that practice of speaking it. But Judy, if we go back to the thing you said, that prayer is talking to God and meditation is listening. And if we think about who we think God is, does God need us to talk to God? Or does God already know? So what does that speaking to God fulfill? Maybe it fulfills the need that we can be honest and speak something, right? There is something to be said for the act of speaking and hearing the words that are said in prayer. But I think for me, that side of prayer has become less and less important, and the meditation side, or I should say the listening side, the openness side, because it doesn't have to even be a meditation space. It just has to be that I am living life in a way that I'm hearing or trying to hear that divine impulse on a regular basis. That to me has become most of prayer.
And there's an action side to that too, from what he's saying, that the way he interacts in the world is the way he prays.
Yeah. Around that same space where Judy read, he goes on to say that prayer involves the deliberate decision to seek to live into that holiness by modeling it and by giving it away. And so that modeling and that giving away of whatever you're learning in prayer is part of the whole action, that you have to do something with it or you're not truly praying.
I think it all comes down to how you define God.
Uh-huh.
The other thing is, for me, in order for me to meditate, I have to have quiet. And quiet isn't something that's of value in our society. A lot of times, it's like it's busyness and always moving around and stuff. And to actually take time in your day to be present in the moment and to have quiet, or just to be mindful of, like, to me, being very aware when I'm eating, of where my food came from, how it got to my table, who prepared it, how it tastes, the texture, being super aware sometimes of things that I'm doing in the moment that are everyday things, or even just like sometimes putting on shoes and socks every morning. It's like, okay, I do this every morning, but how does the sock feel when it goes on my foot? It's like, it's just being that very, very aware. To me, that's a part of what I call meditation, is just being very aware of what you're doing.
Judy, have you read Little Flowers, the book by St. Francis of Assisi?
Yeah.
No. It's by St. Francis. It's a much older book than Thich Nhat Hanh, but Thich Nhat Hanh does that type of thing. But go ahead.
His autobiography, but yeah, okay.
No. One of the things that he talks about is one of the brothers of his convent I think it's Brother Joseph. I might be wrong about that, but he talks about how God was found for Brother Joseph in washing of dishes, right? And the deliberate act of, and the consciousness and the awareness that of doing those dishes in a place that said God is here present in this act. And so you're right that at least one of the important elements of how I define prayer going into the future is being aware. Am I stopping, slowing down, and being aware of things? Do I think where my food comes from, like you said, or any of the many other things that I use on a regular basis? When I drive my car, do I think about all the workers that put that road there and that continue to maintain it? Do I say thank you when the red lights begin to swing behind me? Or do I swear like,
I think
And that's-
that the
People
idea
often
of
say thank you
even
for things. Yeah.
thinking about where food comes from maybe is the modern substitute for grace.
Mhm.
Maybe, right? And the extension of that then would be, what am I doing to assist in that process? How am I taking advantage of those workers in order to get lower prices for my food? Or am I doing something to assist their work, their holy work? And I think that's where Bishop Spong is in most of these things. When I am acting, that is when I am living the prayer that I said I spoke. I think the other thing that's very important about that, and maybe it's done a little bit differently, it's similar, but it's different. It's openness. That as I'm going through my day, am I open to how the world speaks to me? And do I expect to hear the voice of something larger than what I've already experienced? Something different than what I've already experienced. Because if you're like most of us, you go through the same type of patterns that you typically did. But can God speak in those patterns differently each day? My thought is yes.
So sorry, I haven't talked much this morning. I sound like a frog. I used to spend a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but I spent time beating myself up because I didn't have a specific time for prayer, or, I couldn't account for praying. I couldn't say, well, I spent 15 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And then when I was district lay leader, there was one church where the pastor said in the church conference that he spent an hour of his day praying in his office. Nobody was to interrupt. I thought, okay, that's really a kind of absurd thing. I mean, he made sure that it was the time that he was supposed to be on campus and, his 40 hours or whatever it was, which I know pastors don't do 40 hours, but it made me stop and think that I'm praying more than I think I pray more than I gave myself credit for, because when someone would come to my mind, if I hadn't seen them for a while, if I hadn't talked to them, I would just kind of bless them, not for any specific reason or anything. But then there are times when a formulaic prayer kind of works for me. Anne Lamont's Help, Thanks, Wow
Yeah.
reminds me that prayer can be asking or thanking or just enjoying,
Mm-hmm.
or being awestruck by. So that's one of the things. The other one is, and I don't remember exactly where I read it, but it has an Eastern derivative, I think, of, and I think it may have been designed to pray for enemies. Because this is a prayer you could pray for anybody. It's may so and so be happy, may so and so be peaceful, and may so and so be free. And those are three things that I could wish for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are times when I'm having trouble going to sleep that I start naming people and going through that formula thing with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I think there's an energy field or something. I don't know how to explain it, but sometimes when I'm in a hard conversation with somebody that I care about, or they're struggling with something that I don't have any wisdom about, I find myself wandering away from the conversation and thinking, God help me say something right here.
Mm-hmm.
Or just help me not to say something wrong, I guess. It's just as important, because there are those kinds of conversations too.
Absolutely.
And then there are times when I think every breath I take is kind of a prayer. It's like when I'm really conscious, it's every breath in is renewing my spirit, and every breath out is releasing some kind of toxin or something. So mine's kind of a I don't know, global's not even big enough. It's all the time, everywhere, sort of praying.
But what you're talking about is the scripture that Bishop Spong referenced several times. The one from Thessalonians that says, "Pray always, pray constantly." That's hugely challenging, because we can't do those formulaic prayers always, constantly.
Unless
It's
you're a
just
hermit.
impossible. Well, maybe if you're a hermit. So you have to come up with a larger definition. And I think that's what you've done, Judy, is you said, sometimes I pray these prayers, but sometimes I pray like this, and sometimes I am in prayer like this. And I think that's a much better definition of prayer.
Oh, yes.
When we make it small, I have some friends of mine, usually of the more conservative faction, that only pray what I call the just prayer. Do you know the just prayer? God, we just want to thank you for it. And God, we just want to say, and God, we just want to. And they don't know how to escape that pattern of, if that's not the words that are used, they're lost when it comes to prayer. And I think prayer is much more than that. But I think that Bishop Spong really talked about that when he talked about going and visiting his friend in Western Virginia, who had just gotten a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
Did everyone read that story?
Yes, yes.
They had such a rich and a full conversation, hours long conversation. And then he said that little thing that we often as pastors do. Can I pray for you? I don't ask that question very much any longer, because I want the time spent together to be the prayer, not some little thing at the end that was the prayer. I will pray for people if that's what they want, but I love that he felt the awkwardness of that and moved into a new way of doing that. To say that what we just did was prayer. I've been in churches where we do joys and concerns time, and I like joys and concerns time. I think that's really good prayer. It's funny to me how some of my friends will make notes and then they will speak in the prayer the same things the people just barely spoke, as if they needed to be repeated in a prayerful mode, as if
Or from an authoritarian figure.
from an authoritarian figure, as if what had just happened wasn't prayer. When that person stands up in church and says, "This is going on in my family, please pray for me," as if prayer's not happening already before.
As if God
asking,
doesn't hear it.
as if God doesn't hear it, right? And I think anytime that we are in any kind of group where we are sharing our souls, we are praying, where we're sharing our fears and our hopes or whatever it happens to be. That's prayer.
Well, sometimes for me, Jim, putting putting words out is part of my process of figuring out where I am and
Mhm.
what I need to be concerned about or think about. And it's not because God needs the words, it's because I need the words to understand myself.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think words are unimportant. I just think that very often they've been used as the excuse for not doing prayer rather than the way that we actually do prayer, if that makes sense. We speak the words, but are we really praying? And I don't have a problem with words necessarily. It's when it becomes superficial in whatever way, or formulaic, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, and I appreciate as part of celebration that we can't really do a celebration without a prayer time in it. But when we had the last sign up, somebody came up to me and said, "You mean anybody can sign up for prayer? Just anybody?"
Just anybody.
Yeah, that's the way it works. But most people don't want to do that. And I understand because it feels like you're taking on an authority for the whole group or something.
Yeah.
Or trying to be the spokesperson for the
But
whole
that's
group.
why that's why when I was doing a pastoral prayer on a regular basis, I would make sure that I said pretty typically, the worst prayer I pray every week is the pastoral prayer in the middle of worship. And why? Because one person trying to speak for a group, it is not truly prayer. It's not truly relational, right? Or relating between human and God. Maybe it's relating across the humanity that's in the room. But I think we have to be very fair to give people permission. We have to be very honest about that so that they have permission for it not to be the judge of how they do their own prayers. Right? Because oftentimes in pastoral prayer, we get time to be able to think and write and come up with the right words.
Words. And they're
Right?
so very good too, Jim.
It's not that they're bad words. The good words can help us move, but it doesn't necessarily increase the genuineness of the relational aspect of prayer. When he got to the second chapter of In a New Christianity, the Ecclesia of Tomorrow, he talked about how liturgy in churches tends to be even more traditional, even more not relational than individual prayers. And I found that absolutely to be true. And yet, in too many ways, that's the easiest place to be able to measure prayer. And it's a poor measurement for prayer, I think. Although St. Francis does a better job in that there's a much more diverse prayer going on a regular basis at St. Francis than any other church I've ever been a part of. And I think that helps.
When he was talking about the liturgy of the future, which I found very interesting, actually, as far as what celebrations we would have and everything like that. But I wondered whether, of course, my feeling is it's like at least 3 centuries off before we'll ever get to that. But when we are having celebrations, rituals are always a part of celebration. The wedding, the baptism, even if you're not saying that you're cleansing the child of original sin, there's still a ritual. And I think we need rituals. And I think the problem is we need to devise rituals that are not appealing to supernatural. They're appealing to the natural processes of life.
Yeah. The problem is, especially, and Dr. Spong really dealt with this because the church he's a part of is a much more ritualistic church than what Methodism is, and especially what St. Francis is. There's very strong, have to do it this way type of thing. The issue that we talked about last week about the pastor who baptized but really didn't baptize for 20 years because he used one wrong word. That's what happens in liturgical churches, that a single word changes the whole thing. I think we have to ultimately give each other better permission than that these are nice prayers, but there is nothing magical or perfect about them, that another prayer can also be spoken that can be just as good or better for the situation than that which you pray every single week. That there's nothing magical, for example, about the Our Father.
Yeah.
But that you can change it and pray it in a different way, like when we sing Creator, which is essentially that prayer, but is spoken very differently, right? And sung very differently.
And I'm just now thinking that some of our what it feels to me like our favorite songs are prayer songs. Here I Am, Lord, is a prayer.
It is.
And people ask for that song often. And I'm in Spirit of the Living God, people enjoy signing it as well as singing it. I'm trying to think of others that kind of fit that category that we get into and really, and that becomes a community prayer for me.
Absolutely.
More than one person trying to speak for everybody.
Yeah. One of the things that happened just a couple of weeks ago when we did new members, I do a liturgy, right? I ask them some questions, right? Those are not the questions that are in the Methodist book of worship. You might have noticed. I purposely changed them, and I purposely put in some different words. Like, I love every single time when I get to say this raggedy band of believers, because it makes everyone chuckle, right? Because that is part of St. Francis liturgy, right? We know what raggedy band means better than another church would. They wouldn't understand or chuckle at that phrase. But that liturgy has power for us here at St. Francis, doesn't it? Those words of liturgy.
Yes.
So we have to find what it is that works or doesn't work. You'll notice, for example, that one of the things I do not do is I do not do a long and drawn out communion liturgy, right? Which is often very liturgical, very set. I don't do that. Why? Because I think it's lost most of its meaning. It's just said, it's not meaningful any longer. And I can say the same things, use the same images in a much shorter and more impactful way.
I think too, I mean, when you're talking about words that you're using that people at St. Francis understand, the the church, whether it's a Christian church or whatever kind of church, ought to be able to allow any other group that is worshiping, worship in their own way, period. And there should be free movement among groups. When you feel more comfortable somewhere else, so be it. It may, the words that are used in one congregation may not do a thing for you, not because they're wrong liturgically or anything like that. They just aren't what you've grown up with, or they're not familiar to you. I mean, think about someone coming in from a foreign land and listening to some American slang and trying to equate that with the English that they learned in the country before they came. And so we have our own little shortcuts of language and stuff that are familiar to us. And I think that we get so tied up with these are the right magical words and they have to be used in every single church that it makes it difficult for someone to come into the church if they're not familiar with that language.
Yeah. The nice thing about it is, though, having grown up in not a liturgical church, but a church where things happen pretty regularly the same way, I knew that I could go into any church of that denomination and it would feel almost as comfortable as my church at home, right? That there was going to be enough similarity that I would not feel out of place. That's part of why we do that, is so that it's always comfortable no matter where we go. If you go from one Methodist church to another, there's a good chance that one will feel more comfortable than another to you.
I loved the feeling of arriving at St. Francis and how they did everything the right way.
Yeah.
That I you know, they got rid of stuff that I wasn't liking, and you know, I arrived here and they were doing things the way I would like them to be done. So yeah, so I found my church home, which is what we are serving, is we're serving the people who need this type of church home. Yeah. I mean, I really did a search. I tell you, I went to practically, I went to like 7 or 8 different churches around town looking for a church home. And yes, so, well, part of the reason this was my church home was the day I arrived with Michael in a wheelchair, and he was totally accepted into the church, even though he made sound while the sermon was going on. But yeah, so, but yeah, I definitely remember me looking for my church home, because probably for 30 years, I wasn't going to church. I grew up very active as a high school student and, you know, in the Methodist church. But then my husband was kind of an overburdened by religion or something like that. But he was Mennonite, and not old Mennonite, but new Mennonite. So but he wasn't going to church. So I was the one who had to choose to go to church myself. So that's but it was quite a I'm sorry, talking too much.
No, that's okay. I thought you'd finished. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Well, I know when I left the evangelicals, I found St. Francis because I literally Googled progressive churches near me. And what came up was St. Francis. But one of the things that I still question a little bit at St. Francis is the practice of communion. And I've talked to this before, Jim. It's like, first of all, you said the dirty word at St. Francis is Jesus. And yet it's so sacred to do communion because you're doing the blood, the flesh of Jesus. That's essentially what communion is. But to me, communion should be sitting down and sharing a meal with each other, doing a potluck or something. I've always thought that would be much more of a communion to me than having a little piece of bread and some grape juice. Book, that's done, or whatever. That just is so formulaic that it has no meaning. It's like I do it because everybody else does it sometimes, but it has absolutely no meaning to me.
Yeah, I'm right there. I'm right there with you, Judy. That's why I often make jokes about, I'm sorry, this baggie is not quite what you're used to, right? Those kinds of jokes, because that communion, I don't want it alone to be, I mean, that ritual of communion to be the end all. That's okay. Now I've touched God. It's as Bishop Spong pointed out, those rituals are what hopefully open us up to what is without limits, what is bigger and better than that. Because you're right. Sometimes the very best communion that happens every single week is when people go out to lunch together and sit over the meal and talk about whatever happened in the service. I think that is exactly what Jesus meant by communion.
Well, the ritual words say it's a remembrance. And I think if we said, this is just a reminder of communing together, even though maybe we can't all go to lunch together today, this is a reminder of what it feels like to commune together. So that it can take the ritual idea away and just that, but it's still going to be ritual, no matter what you do to someone or for someone.
Yeah.
But I think that, and you're right, Judy, that St. Francis has jettisoned a lot of stuff, but somehow communion still feels right to me. And but it's not that I believe that there's a miracle coming down and changing these elements to the blood and the body of Jesus, as in some churches is the belief. I think of it really just as a remembrance, and I do enjoy a little bit of ritual, not a whole lot. That's why I go to the early service, but I do enjoy it.
Yeah,
Ritual doesn't have to be at all. I think rituals are actually a good thing. It's just the meaning behind that particular ritual has no meaning for me.
Yeah.
The way it's done.
Well, and part of what we have to do then is realize that in you, as we must realize other things like that in each other. And I don't think any church prays perfectly for everybody.
No.
How do we have part of what helps you to pray and part of what helps me to pray and put it into some kind of stew that allows all of us to eat together? Right? That's the difficult part.
When I came to Tucson, I went to at least 3 other churches, and there is a Methodist church that's 1.5 miles from where I live, Desert Skies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice church, and all things being equal, I probably would have gone there, except at the time I was looking for a reconciling congregation, and St. Francis was it. And I remember when David gave me a call after I had gone a couple of times, and I said, well, I was still trying to decide what I was going to do. And I said, Desert Skies was closer to me. And I know from my own experience, having a church closer is definitely better for keeping me going to church. I said, but my heart is really at St. Francis. And he says, well, then you've answered that, haven't you? And it was true, and so every Sunday when I pass Desert Skies, driving 12 miles instead of 1.5 miles, I sort of think about that. And as I said, it's a nice church. And they do good work. I definitely partake of their yard sale and bring donations there and everything, but no, St. Francis is it. It speaks to me.
But part of that is, if we're redefining prayer individually, where is it that I find a way to be able to communicate to God in this moment?
Yeah.
To have a space of feeling God. We all have to figure that out differently, and we have to figure that out corporately differently than what another church might. So, for example, meditation of silence, like you described, Judy, never works for me. You know what happens if I do a meditation of silence?
My brain starts going all over the place.
No, I fall asleep.
Yeah,
My
That's-
brain
that's
just starts wandering.
That's just what happens to me. And so I've learned that my meditative practice, my place of openness and awareness, that where is when I'm able to move, that I have to have movement involved in it somehow. And so I like that there's a space like our labyrinth, which allows movement to happen. Because just sitting and listening wouldn't work for me. And I think that's what we have to figure out, or what are the different modalities that different people need? And are we open to that? Do we have a space for that? Can it be part of who we are?
I have a question about Lent.
Yes.
But when I was a little girl, Lent didn't mean too much in the Methodist church I was going to, because they thought it was still too much of a Catholic thing going on.
Yeah.
And we discussed have in the last 30 years or so, it's become, I think, somewhat more important in the Methodist church, and having Lenten meditations and things like that. So how do we celebrate this time of reflection, is what I would call it, as we're coming up onto the spring and everything, if we're not going to pray to a theistic God?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that, because we are doing something very different this year for Lent than we've done before. We're actually looking at Celtic spirituality.
Really?
We're working through a book of different saints of that movement, and saying this is how they often challenge the church, and were challenged by it. Most of, if not all of these folks, were at some point or another excommunicated by the church because they spoke outside of. Good, nice.
I have been doing this for the last 3 or 4 years. A friend of mine 4 years ago sent me this book. It's put out by 2 Episcopal priests. It is a fun thing to do, and there's about 5 of us who text each other. Who each day there are 2 saints, and we have to pick which one it's going to be, and it's done like March Madness in the basketball thing, except that we're picking the Saints to win. But it's a learning experience about these people, and whether we think this person deserves to be the saint who wins that day because of the way they live their life or not. And so that has been my practice in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah,
But I sense I want to do something else too.
And so we've often used Lent as a penitential time, an introspective time. I think we've gone through 2 years of Lent.
Well, yes.
To do that.
And I'm
so
always interested in study, so that's part of my thing too.
So I think why I'm using the Celtic saints is so that we say, what more can we be? What do we grow into now? You know, what do we open ourselves up to? And so for me, that goes along with the discussion that we're already having, and the ones that we're going to have. Because I was struck when I read these books this week, that the first chapter of Unbelievable was called The Death of Prayer. And then at the end of that section on prayer, you know what the next section is called? Life after death. Right? So if we die in the way we did understand prayer, what gets rebirthed? What comes out of that? And I think that's what Dr. Spong is asking in all of these sections. What can be, not just what do we give up? What more are we going to turn ourselves into because of this? So that's our next section. What is life and death mean in the midst
I think
of?
that's important, Jim, because I think that that's what a lot of people are afraid of. They're afraid if they give up what they have had in the past, that they're not going to have anything.
Yeah. It's an essential question. What are you giving to me that is worth my time and effort, right? All right, my friends, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. This has been great.
Yeah.
I wish we had even more time to talk because this has been rich and wonderful. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Love to see you guys.
Bye-bye.
Yep. See you next week.
Bye-bye.